welcome back once again. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nivishesha Shunyavadi Pashtata Adishatarne. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So we're continuing with our series on Srila Rupa Goswami and his worship of his beloved Ishtadev Govindaji. In our last lecture, we concluded with the departure of Srila Rupa Goswami from this world. We mentioned that upon his demise, all of Vrindavan was plunged into lamentation. And desiring to understand and appreciate just how dear Rupa Goswami was to the Vraja-vasis, I researched his departure a little bit more, and I was surprised to read that not only were the Gaudiya Vaishnavas affected, the followers of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but also members of other sampradayas as well. You may remember in our last lecture we quoted the Sadhana Dipika, wherein it said about Rupa Goswami, and I'll quote it again, that he could prepare deities, draw expertly. He was a master of astrology and mathematics. He was fluent in Sanskrit, Persian, Bengali, and other languages. He was also renowned as a Gaudiya Vaishnava philosopher and scholar, and he was well known to all sampradayas. Of course, we know that all the Goswamis were loved by everyone. That's there in the Sad Goswami Ashtakam by Srinivasacharya. We hear in the very first verse, and I quote, "I offer my respectful obeisances unto the 6 Goswamis who are always engaged in chanting the holy name of Krishna and dancing. They are just like the ocean of love of God, and they are popular both with the gentle and with the ruffians, because they're not envious of anyone. Whatever they do, they are all pleasing to everyone, and they're fully blessed by Lord Chaitanya. Thus they are engaged in missionary activities meant to deliver all the conditioned souls in the material universe," unquote. But it's interesting that in the Sadhana Dipika, it's mentioned that Rupa Goswami was popular in particular with other sampradayas at that time. Now one might, naturally assume there would be, some little tension perhaps between various sampradayas at the time with their significantly diverse goals, methodologies, practices, etc. But that wasn't the case, for Rupa Goswami. Not only the gentle and the ruffians loved him, but apparently all kinds of transcendentalists also loved him as well, members of other sampradayas. And I actually came across another quote by someone I quoted in the last lecture, Hari Rama Vyas. He was a devotee in the Radha Ballabha Sampradaya. And he lived, of course, during the same time as the 6 Goswamis. And in that book he wrote, Vyasavarni, and I found in verse 75, or it begins in verse 75, he writes, a number of verses here, "All glories to Sanatan and Rupa, who are my heart and soul. These 2 brothers are the shelter of fallen souls and the knowers of pure devotional service. They are the water well of prema and the sweetness of braj. Their minds are always engaged in the devotional practice based on Srimad Bhagavatam, and they are the gems of their family lineage. Their glories are expanded in the 14 worlds because of their beautiful art of verse and voice. Verse and voice. The cooling shadow of the dust of their soft lotus feet removes the burning sensation of the sun of the age of Kali. I, Vyas, always worship these 2 brothers who are the beautiful devotees of Sri Radha's lotus feet." So it's just a small example of someone from another sampradaya appreciating so much Srila Rupa Goswami. It's interesting. So when Srila Rupa Goswami left this world, the loss was felt by all devotees of the Lord. And our acharyas say that it was the glories of Srila Rupa and Srila Sanatana Goswami that inspired the Rajput Kings from Rajasthan, beginning with our hero, Rajman Singh, to maintain the high standard of worship that Rupa Goswami had established for Govindaji, as well as for the deity of Srimati Radharani, who during the time of Rupa Goswami was sent by King Purushottam Deva from Jagannath Puri. We'll discuss that particular pastime in a future class, how Srimati Radharani came to join her, Govinda. But to begin with, to maintain a high standard of worship after Rupa Goswami left for Govindaji, the royal families of Rajasthan regularly donated large amounts of money from 1590 up till 1667, particularly for the Bhoga offerings. I thought it was so nice how the royalty was supporting the deities. These royal families from Rajasthan, they also provided all the funds for deity outfits, festival expenses, flowers, salaries for the pujaris I was reading, and whenever possible, they granted land free of tax for Govindaji's ever-expanding herd of cows, and for other purposes as well. For example, the other day in the Vrindavan Research Institute, I found out that today's Lloyd Bazaar, everyone knows Lloyd Bazaar, that's where devotees do their shopping. That area was previously the marketplace of Govindaji, which the royals of the Rajput dynasty established to sell the Mahaprasadam of Govindaji, the Mahaprasadam that he ate. As well as, they would also, in that market you could also buy his dresses, different outfits and other worshipable items. And their purpose, the royals, in establishing that market was to attract pilgrims to Vrindavan. So a special place, what we know now as Lloyd Bazaar, was Govinda Bazaar. It was actually Rajman Singh's idea. He arranged for the property that we now know as Lloyd Bazaar. And again, it was called Govinda Dev Bazaar in those days. But how did the name change? I also found that out. Later, around, let's say about 150 years ago, some shopkeepers started selling woolen chadars on the street of Govinda Bazaar. Now in Braj Bhasa, as well as Hindi language, a woolen chadar is known as loi, L-O-I, loi. So after some time, that bazaar became known as Lloyd Bazaar. There you go, Lloyd Bazaar. And I heard recently from the locals that all the shops of Lloyd Bazaar that are on rent now. They've been on rent for hundreds of years. The shops of Lloyd Bazaar are on rent, and some of that rent goes to the Govindaji Mandir in Jaipur, even today. Isn't that interesting? So next time you go to Lloyd Bazaar, you'll have a different perspective. This is where you could get the Mahaprasad of Govindaji. And even now, all those shop owners, they're in part of the rent that they pay goes to Govindaji at his mandir in Jaipur. So sweet. Now, another way the royal families maintained Govindaji was by giving precious gold and silver jewelry to him on special occasions, all kinds of valuable gifts. I actually came across many letters and documents in the Institute stating that these gifts were given in loving devotion to Govindaji. So these royal families were very attached to the temple and the culture of worshipping Govindaji. And I read how they would often make pilgrimages to Yogapith, where the big temple was established, of course. And this Yogapith was, for a long time, one of the main places, if not the main place, for pilgrimage in Vrindavan. As the years went by, of course, or the centuries went by, many people would come to Vrindavan, and Govindaji's temple, as it stood in those days, was probably the main place of pilgrimage. Nowadays, it's not as popular, being situated, you could say, some distance from Vrindavan village itself, or on the border there. I hope that through these series of lectures, you will be encouraged to go there and take darshan of the temple. And actually nowadays they are also worshipping Pratibhu, or means they've established other deities of Radha Govinda. But so much of our history is there. We should go there regularly and pay our respects. And just to impress upon you again the paramount, if I could say the paramount importance of that particular place, Yogapith, where the temple of Govindaji is standing, I will read to you a few stanzas from the work of a very renowned disciple of Srila Raghunath Bhatta Goswami. His name was Gadadhara Bhatta. And he wrote a very beautiful poem called Shri Vrindavan Yogapith Varanam, in glorification of Yogapith, where Govindaji was discovered and the temple is established. Now this Shri Govinda Yogapitha Varanam by Gadadhar Bhatta, it's very popular here in Braj. When you start inquiring how everything's connected, you find out that, these things are very dear. These poems, these songs glorifying Vrindavan, they're very popular. People sing them, although we may not know them as ISKCON devotees. But this particular work by Gadadhar Bhatta, it consists of 54 verses glorifying Yogapith. So I read several times the 54 verses, but we don't have time to repeat them all. But I'll recite a few of them for you, and you can gain more appreciation for Yogapith. So when you come here next time, you'll go there. So here's some of the verses. I'll recite some of the verses. I offer my obeisances to the Lord's lotus feet. By his blessings, this devotee says, I'm able to tell something about the opulence of Vrindavan, where the crystal clear blue water of Kalindi River flows, where the highest philosophy of Vedas and Vedanta is situated, here at Yogapith. The forest there is filled with red, yellow, and white flowers. On every flower there are intoxicated bumblebees drinking the nectar. In Yogapith, swans, birds, cuckoos, and other birds sing songs in higher notes. Unlimited kinds of birds live there, and so many that the mind is unable to describe. The ground is decorated with various kinds of gems and pearls, that upon seeing their effulgence, even the king of night, the moon, feels shame. The trunks of the trees are like pillars of gold, and their creepers are like gems embedded in the pillars. In some places, bright camphor is placed, and in some other places, vermilion powder is situated there for fragrance. There's a small pond where the lotuses are blossoming in nectar-like green water, like rubies embedded in an emerald. This place is very dear to the saints, where all the 6 climates serve the divine couple, which is beyond comparison. The parrots and birds are singing songs in the 5th note, like they are in competition with each other and are teaching others the notes of love. The forest of Vrindavan Yogapith is situated in its full glories and bliss within the forest of blossoming kadamba trees. Millions of Indras are sitting in hopes of getting darshan at that glorious place known as Yogapith. That's just a few of the 54 verses written by that devotee. So they wrote for us to inspire us in our love and devotion for Sri Vrindavan Dham. So at Yogapith, the grand temple of Govindaji stood gracefully after its construction for almost 80 years until the Muslim tyrant Aurangzeb, I don't even want to pronounce his name, the Muslim tyrant Aurangzeb ordered it destroyed. What? Destroyed? It's difficult to even mention about this Muslim emperor who is said to have destroyed thousands and thousands and thousands of temples and shrines throughout much of his empire in India. I was reading quite a lot about it in detail. How many temples and shrines of all different religious traditions, except of course Islam. We have to speak about him a little bit, just so we can understand the history here. This Aurangzeb was born in a royal family. His father was actually the emperor. In November 1618. And he grew up being trained as a prince. And he was always in competition with 3 other brothers, all of whom aspired one day to be the emperor themselves. There was a lot of competition. There was no love. It's like competition between these brothers. Now historians, they say that Aurangzeb, as he grew and took on more responsibility, actually he became emperor himself eventually. His slogan was, Ya Takht, Ya Tabut. Ya Takht, Ya Tabut, which means either the throne or the grave. This is, he's growing up, this is his idea. I want to be emperor. Ya Takht, Ya Tabut. He was known for that phrase. Either the throne or the grave. So you're getting an idea what he's like. And Aurangzeb demonstrated this conviction when he was in his 30s, and he infamously murdered 2 of his brothers and drove a 3rd out of India, and then he locked his father, the emperor, in a jail in Agra's Red Fort. Agra also had a red fort. He never made it out of there, the emperor. Then he declared himself emperor and celebrated. And I was reading his scribes, they wrote, quote, when a celebration is adorned like paradise itself, even the skies rise up from their place to dance. When a celebration is adorned like paradise itself, even the skies rise up from their place to dance. This is nothing spiritual. This is just the motto that he imbibed. There was a huge celebration when he became emperor. So with no opposition, Aurangzeb, by this time actually he was around late 30s or maybe he was 40, he began his rule over a population of 150 million people. Now that may not sound a lot, but at that time in India, that was really, you could say, the greater portion of India. 150 million people. Just shows you what the world was like at that time. And he initially said that, a famous quote, he said, an emperor ought to stand midway between gentleness and severity. An emperor ought to stand midway between gentleness and severity. But historically, his rule was one of, you could say, only severity. For he gave himself a name, Alamgir, Alamgir means conqueror of the world. So you have to be pretty severe if you want to conquer the world. And therefore he ruthlessly conquered kingdom after kingdom during his 49 years of reign. Now, we Gaudiya Vaishnavas were not spared of his cruelty. For on August 28th, 1667, I really got into it. I really spent hours there at the Institute. On August 28, 1667, he issued what became known as the Black Decree. The Black, you could say Proclamation, the Black Decree. This decree said, and I quote, it's not easy to quote it, but I quote it, His Majesty the Emperor, eager to establish Islam, has issued orders for all governors and of all the provinces in our vast kingdom to demolish the schools and temples of the Hindus, and with the utmost urgency put down the teaching and public practice of this religion and their misbelievers. The emperor is making this proclamation. Demolish the schools and all the temples of the Hindus with great urgency. And they may no longer say anything in public, these misbelievers. So this decree eventually led to the destruction of, again, thousands upon thousands of temples and schools throughout India, Hindu schools throughout India. But historians have noted that, quote, the Krishna temples in Vrindavan were the first target of this decree. The Krishna temples in Vrindavan were the first target of this decree. And Aurangzeb was personally involved in the destruction of many of the temples here in Braj, especially Govinda's temple, Govindaji's temple. Soon after issuing this black decree, Aurangzeb was visiting Mathura on some government business. And that evening, after offering namaz is the Muslims' way of praying to God, to Allah. So after offering namaz at a large mosque, Aurangzeb was, sitting outside, relaxing, and he saw some unusual bright stars, what appeared to him to be bright stars, twinkling quite high in the sky. And curious, he asked one of his ministers why these stars appeared particularly bright that evening. And his minister replied that the stars were in fact lights coming from the Hindu temple of Govindadev in nearby Vrindavan. Now, it was actually a Ekadasi that day. These were probably a lot of new details that you've never heard, but this we got from the books in the Institute. A lot of things come down through oral tradition, but this is what was written. It was actually a Ekadasi that day, and there was a tradition in Govindaji's temple that on Ekadasi the pujaris lit up 51 very large ghee lamps on top of the temple. And Govindaji's temple was very tall. So 51 large ghee lamps on Ekadasi were lit up on top of the temple. And further research revealed that this tradition came from Jagannath Puri in Orissa, actually. And how so? Because when Lord Chaitanya sent Kashishwara, you remember, Kashishwara to Vrindavan from Puri to assist in Govindaji's worship on the request of Rupa Goswami, Mahaprabhu instructed Kashishwara to implement the same manner of worship for Govindaji as was going on in the Jagannath temple in Puri. So the lighting of huge lamps on top of the Puri temple was a tradition going back thousands of years. Therefore, as the in the worship of Govindaji, the pujaris would, light these huge ghee lamps on top of the temple. And therefore, on that day of Ekadasi in Vrindavan, Aurangzeb saw these lamps as far away as Mathura. Now, some scholars say that Aurangzeb saw them from Agra. I used to tell that part. Or even Delhi, they say. But from our research in the Institute, we concluded, because there's so many different descriptions, that Aurangzeb saw the lights from a mosque in Mathura. Now, of course, he already knew about Govindaji temple, and certainly he was planning to destroy it. But I read that when one of his ministers whispered in his ear that evening that his great-grandfather, Akbar I, who we spoke extensively about recently, spent 30 lakhs on building that temple with red sandstone, Aurangzeb, he became furious. I was reading, his lips were quivering, he was trembling. People moved away from him. And he said loudly, "How could an emperor of Moghul lineage build a Hindu temple larger than any existing mosque?" How could an emperor of Moghul Muslim lineage build a Hindu temple larger than any existing mosque? Then he ordered his minister to go with his army and begin demolishing Govindaji temple the next morning. He said it very loudly, actually, I was reading. And he concluded by saying, "And bring the top of this temple to my feet." Bring the top of this temple to my feet. So fortunately, a Rajput soldier, remember there's alliances between the Muslims and the Hindus, so we described that earlier. This Rajput soldier who was serving in Aurangzeb's army, he overheard Aurangzeb's order. And so that, a few hours later in the night, he secretly went to Vrindavan, riding on a horse. The horse's name is there in the books, written by the scribes. His horse was named Pavana. Now Pavana, depending on how you pronounce it, can mean different things. But written and with the diacritics as it is, in Sanskrit, Pavana can mean as fast as the wind. So this Rajput soldier, he rode on Pavana, meaning he went as fast as the wind. And with this brave soldier, we offer him our deep respects, arrived at Govindaji's temple, he knocked on the door of Shivaji Goswami, the head priest at that time. Shivaji Goswami, who was living in a house just adjacent to Govindaji's temple. And when Goswamiji came to the door, the soldier said, "Goswami, Aurangzeb is sending half his army to break Thakurji, Govindaji, along with the whole temple in a few hours." So still groggy from, being woken up in the middle of the night, Shivaji Goswami ran and began ringing a gigantic bell that hung on the top floor of Govindaji's temple. And hearing the loud ringing of that bell, all the pujaris and devotees in the vicinity, they came running to the courtyard of the temple, where Shivaji Goswami told them about the impending danger for Govindaji. And of course, he also warned all the other pujaris and temples in Vrindavan of the danger that Aurangzeb's army is coming to destroy our deities and our temples. So knowing well that Aurangzeb had ordered the destruction of all Hindu temples, he was busy, his army was busy doing that, the devotees, we're speaking particularly now about the Govindaji temple. There's many other pastimes connected to other temples as well, but I was reading that the devotees of the Govindaji temple, they began working furiously in the mammoth task of hiding Govindaji, Srimati Radharani, Vrinda Devi, and Yogamaya in a nearby kund, a lake called Govinda Kund. It's a different lake from the Govinda Kund we know out at Govardhan Hill. I've recently been to this Govinda Kund near the Govinda temple. It's in really bad shape. Such an historic place, because this is where they took the deities and put them at the bottom of the lake to hide them from the attacking forces. So it's a very historic place, but it's in really bad shape. So perhaps one day some devotees or some pious persons can renovate that historic lake. That would be a nice savor for any of you who are interested. Unfortunately, they moved the deities, and they're big deities, and they only had a few hours. But unfortunately, there was no time to hide all the gold and jewels and, paraphernalia that had been given by the Rajput Kings over the past almost 100 years. There was no time to collect all that. In fact, and this really touched my heart, the devotees were more concerned about the many manuscripts, the many palm leaf writings of the 6 Goswamis that were being kept, protected, and preserved in the Govindaji temple. So instead of taking all the gold and silver and jewels, the devotees, considering those writings to be infinitely more important, they quickly gathered those sacred writings in a large wooden box, and several devotees carried that into the Vrindavan forest. They were thinking where to put it, and they saw this huge field of mud. You could go up to your waist in it, actually. And they waded out into this mud and then put this wooden chest at the bottom of this field of mud. And actually, when I read that, my eyes filled with tears, thinking that, myself and my team here in Vrindavan have, you could say in one sense, been entrusted with the sacred service along with the Vrindavan Research Institute now, of saving and preserving and eventually publishing those very same scriptures. I had a talk with the president over there, and he was telling me that previously, before this new management came in at the Vrindavan Research Institute, the previous management just wanted to protect those scriptures. But the new management, the president said to me, these acharyas, all these great devotees, they wrote these books to be read. So let's work together with ISKCON and not only preserve them, but get them published. It's a huge task. Again, there's 32,000 scriptures, but our team's going to focus on our Gaudiya Vaishnava scriptures for now. We've got a whole plan. I'll tell you about the plan later, but anyway. These books, of course, they were not only in the Govindaji temple, they were other places as well, because the Goswamis and the writers at that time, they wrote so many scriptures, but some of our primary scriptures were placed in this wooden box in the mud in this field to protect them. You see what these scriptures have gone through. We must rescue them now, again. So after securing the Shastras, the devotee men quickly hid the women and children in various inconspicuous places, like homes and houses and so forth, because often Aurangzeb's soldiers would take women as slaves and then engage the male children in various ways in the army. So then Dwadasi was the next morning, so Aurangzeb's Moghul army arrived. It was frightening. The scene is it's frightening how they came on their horses, and they ascended the sacred Yogapith hill, armed with all kinds of tools and instruments to begin breaking the temple. My heart was like beating as I read it. And there, they were met by many heroic Gaudiya saints and sadhus, embracing the pillars, it's described, embracing the pillars of Govindaji's temple in the hope that the soldiers would not destroy them. But within minutes, all those Gaudiya saints and those Vaishnavas were slaughtered, and the work of destruction began. I read that the screams of the devotees who were being killed with swords and axes reverberated throughout Vrindavan. And while the destruction was going on, many of those soldiers were stealing that paraphernalia that was left behind, all the gold jewelry and other expensive items. Actually, many details of the destruction are given by the Muslim scribes or the writers at that time who witnessed the demolition of the temple, but I'm not going to share that here. Just by going through these documents last few days, I actually had to endure 2 nights of nightmares in a row. I had horrible nightmares as a result. I'm not going to share all the details, but with that, with what I've said, you can understand. Basically, the soldiers destroyed 4 stories of the temple in 2 months' time. Now, the temple was actually, you could say, 7 stories tall, but 3 of those stories were small, we could say, sub-stories. They weren't like a big story. They were like a mini story, where especially different artistic activities would go on. Bhajans and fire yajnas and pastime telling, etc. They weren't major stories. So that the temple was technically 7 stories high from the base. We have the base, the temple room itself, and then 7 stories. But because those small sub-stories, we'd say 4 stories were destroyed. That's how you read it in the books. 4 stories were destroyed. But really it was like 7 in one sense. And not only Govindaji's temple, Aurangzeb's soldiers were also busy destroying many temples in Vrindavan. But Aurangzeb, he had something against Govindaji's temple because, it was so magnificent, bigger than any mosque, etc. So he was kept informed of the dismantling of Govindaji's temple over time. He'd get reports and he'd just, swell with pride. He took great pleasure on each floor or each story, small story, as it was destroyed. And that material, the red sandstone, which had been given by Akbar for the construction of that temple, he used that for the construction of various mosques in the area. But of course, he was very frustrated that his soldiers could not locate the many deities of Vrindavan that had been hidden before his army arrived. For example, in Govinda Kund, they didn't figure it out. They didn't go out into the forest and go through the mud. They didn't think that the deities would be put at the bottom of a lake. These were decisions that were taken very quickly, and it worked. And the fate of those deities will be the subject of the next 2 classes. How our deities, our historic deities, were rescued, and how their worship goes on very nicely even today. Now, Aurangzeb was actually intent on the total destruction of Govindaji's temple in particular. Very often that's how he did it. There was a temple, Keshava temple, in Mathura that he ordered to be destroyed. It was destroyed a number of occasions previously, but nothing left. And they built a mosque on that temple. Anyway. So he really, in his mind, there would be nothing left of Govindaji's temple. But by the arrangement of the Lord, that was not to be. for one day, as Aurangzeb was sitting outside a mosque, maybe the same mosque, I don't know, in Mathura, inquiring from his ministers about the progress of the demolition of Govindaji's temple, Mathura was struck by a violent earthquake. And at the same moment, Aurangzeb was suddenly attacked by a swarm. The scribes, they say, 1,000 bees. 1,000 bees, within moments, were stinging him all over his body. They got under his clothes and his head, and they were stinging him all over his body. And as his body painfully swelled from all these dangerous, poisonous bites, he was quickly whisked away to the inside of the mosque. And withering in pain there, he looked up to his physician. It's described, who was a pious Muslim. And in a desperate voice, Aurangzeb said, "Why is this happening to me?" And his physician answered, "Sire, it can only be because of your order to demolish that which is sacred to those of Hindu faith, the Govindadev temple." Sire, it can only be because of your order to demolish that which is sacred to those of the Hindu faith, the Govindadev temple. Now that was a risky thing to say to Aurangzeb. But Aurangzeb took his physician's, his doctor's words to heart. And immediately he ordered the demolition and destruction of Govindaji's temple to stop. Hare Krishna. And that's why today, Prabhus, we have the great privilege of taking darshan. It's still a magnificent structure, what is actually left. It's described as an architectural wonder, actually. So that's why we still have something to see. But soon afterwards, he built, listen to this, Aurangzeb built a small mosque, or you could say they call it a mihrab, M-E-H-R-A-B, mihrab, like a small shrine, a Muslim shrine, on top of the ruins of the temple. And there, whenever possible, when Aurangzeb was in the vicinity of Vrindavan, he would go there, he'd go up the stairs, and he'd say his namaz, his prayers, his Muslim prayers, in that little Muslim shrine that he built on top of the temple. It was there for centuries, actually. So, now despite all of Aurangzeb's exploits in his attempt to be Alamgir, conqueror of the world, in the end, he died a very unhappy man. I saw a document at the Institute where a scholar named Jadunath Sharkar, he translated Aurangzeb's last will and testament into English. I just grabbed that. Okay, what do you say? In English, this Jadunath Sharkar, Aurangzeb's will. And there I read, quote, Aurangzeb, you could say wrote or had written. He says, quote, "I know not who I am, nor where I shall go, or what will happen to the sinner full of sins. Now I will say goodbye to everyone in this world and entrust everyone to the care of God." So he was lamenting, considered himself a sinner. I don't know to what degree he actually lamented. Certainly what he did is, anyway. So this is the fate of a person who gives trouble to Vaishnavas. Such a person dies with a heart full of regret and lamentation. Now, it should also be noted that by Krishna's arrangement, a brave Kshatriya king named Shivaji, and many of you who are of Indian origin, your hair will stand on end when you hear Shivaji. He was a great warrior. He was actually a disciple of the Vaishnava Saint Tukaram. Many times people just remember him as believe he was from Maharashtra. Very powerful warrior, Shivaji. But he was, perhaps first and foremost, we could say, a disciple of the Vaishnava Saint Tukaram. And Shivaji, he soon arose to defeat the entire Mughal Empire in India. In fact, I was reading in Aurangzeb's last words on his deathbed, he lamented that he was being defeated at the hands of Shivaji. These were his last words. Quote, "Negligence for a single moment becomes the cause of disgrace for long years. The escape of the wretched Shivaji took place through my carelessness, and I've had to labor hard against his army to the very end of my life as a result of it." Then he died. He'd actually imprisoned Shivaji at one point, but Shivaji escaped and continued his battle against, the tyranny of the Emperor Aurangzeb. So he was lamenting that he was losing everything as he died. And in time, this is history, but it's interesting, in time, Shivaji's successors defeated Aurangzeb's entire empire and conquered back all the places that he had won over. Now, another interesting note here is that in the late 1800s, that small structure that Aurangzeb had built, a little Muslim shrine on top of Govindaji's temple, was removed by an Englishman named Salomon Grosh, who at that time was a public servant in the British government. He was in charge of some of the affairs in the Mathura district. He actually wrote a book about his activities here, famous book. And there in that book, I saw a photo, because this is, the late 1800s, so photography was there, a photo of Govindaji's temple with that shrine at the top. And another photo when it wasn't there. Oh, Hare Krishna. So we'll stop here. And I think that it would be appropriate to remember all those devotees, those Vaishnavas, those Vaishnava saints and those devotees who selflessly sacrificed their lives to try to protect that sacred temple of Govindaji at Yogapith in Vrindavan Dham. The temple's, as you know now, it's a great milestone in the history of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. And those pujaris and those saints and those devotees, they did their very best, embracing the pillars. No, you shall not destroy this temple of our Lord. They sacrificed their lives. So let us remember them. And we can appreciate them even more by quoting our beloved Srila Prabhupada in his purport to Bhagavad Gita, 11th chapter, verse 55. And I quote Prabhupada. There are many examples in history of devotees of the Lord who risked their lives for the spreading of God consciousness. The favorite example is Lord Jesus Christ. He was crucified by the non-devotees, but he sacrificed his life for spreading God consciousness. Of course, it would be superficial to understand that he was killed. Similarly, in India, also there are many examples such as Thakur Haridas and Prahlad Maharaj. Why such risk? Because they wanted to spread Krishna consciousness, and it is difficult. A Krishna conscious person knows that if a man is suffering, it is due to his forgetfulness of his eternal relationship with Krishna. Therefore, the highest benefit one can render to human society is relieving one's neighbor from all material problems. In such a way, a pure devotee is engaged in the service of the Lord. Now we can imagine how merciful Krishna is to those engaged in his service, risking everything for him. Therefore it is certain that such persons must reach the supreme planet after leaving the body. Unquote. Jai Shri Prabhupada. History. So, in a few days we'll describe another history class, you could say, real history class. We'll describe how all these deities who were hidden from the invaders, and how eventually many of them made it to Rajasthan, to the full protection of the Rajput Kings there. We know that Govindaji and Gopinath and Damodar and Radha Vinod, those famous deities, they made it to Jaipur, where they're worshipped to this very day in very wonderful fashion. And we'll describe other deities and where they are as well, that are Vrindavan deities. It's a really nice Leela, how they were rescued, and how, again, other devotees sacrificed their lives for these deities and for the movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as Srila Prabhupada so nicely described. So I really enjoyed researching and delivering this lecture, and I hope that you also appreciate it. So I'll see you in a couple days. Shri Shri Gauranitai ki, Shri Shri Krishna Balaram ki, Shri Shri Radhashama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Shrimati Radharani ki, Shri Rupa Goswami Prabhupada ki, Shri Govinda Deva ki, all the deities of Vrindavan ki, all those who have served them through the centuries ki, Gaura Premanandi, Shri Prabhupada ki, Jai Jai Sri Sri Radhe.